Novartis chief executive Vasant Narasimhan says that leadership is about empowering others to be their best. Born in Pittsburgh in 1976 to parents who had emigrated to the US from India, Vas is one of the world's youngest leaders of a major global company. With a workforce of over 100,000, Novartis products reach over 800 million people worldwide. After getting his doctorate in medicine from Harvard in 2003, Vas says he thought of practicing medicine, but instead joined the World Health Organization to work on malaria and HIV treatment programs in Africa. He then went on to spend 2 years at management consultancy McKinsey before his meteoric rise through the ranks at Novartis. As the entire world's eyes are on the pharma sector to develop a cure for COVID-19, Vas says we will only eradicate the virus when we have effective leadership and collaboration between the public and private sector. COVID has also reshaped plans for this show. We originally spoke to Vas in February before social distancing became commonplace. In mid-August, I spoke to him again. Today, on Leaders with Lacqua, Vas Narasimhan, the chief executive of Novartis. Vas, you worked for the WHO, you were a consultant, and now you lead Novartis. How has it shaped the leader you've become in dealing with this pandemic?
I think my leadership journey has been one that's all about a range of different experiences. I started out as a physician, public health physician, working in developing countries, seeing outbreaks like HIV/AIDS, working on malaria, working, as you said, with the WHO. Later worked primarily in drug and vaccine development, so really developing some of the therapeutics and vaccine technologies that we're so interested in today. And then ultimately now in this role as a CEO. What I find to be incredibly valuable in a situation like this is having that breadth of experience, everything from on-the-ground public health experience, science-based innovation, leading large organizations, and actually seeing through various challenges, whether that was at the early days of the HIV/AIDS, which was a major pandemic, to the H1N1 pandemic. Having seen some of these situations and how they've evolved, I think has given me hopefully some perspective to help lead Novartis through this period.
You gave an interview in August 2019 where you said we are not at all prepared for a pandemic. You were thinking about a pandemic. Why were politicians and governments not?
I think there's an immediacy problem for public policymakers. You tend to think about what are the things that are going to impact your country or your communities in the next few years. After, we have had multiple pandemics over the last 50 years, but most notably after the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, there was a flurry of interest in trying to build up real capacity in the system, manufacturing capacity, R&D capacity. International organizations like Sep.04 for vaccines were built up. But then what I observed is as the years passed and we moved further and further away from that swine flu pandemic, interest waned, funding moved away. We at Novartis ultimately sold the factories that we had built up for vaccine production, ultimately moved out of the vaccines business. So I remember in that interview reflecting back, I realized that many of the things we know you need for a pandemic, warm preparedness, technology, readiness, strong surveillance, had sort of withered away because we had lost our memories. And I think what we need to do is build much longer term memories. It's difficult to mount these kinds of global responses in very short periods of time.
Do you think this pandemic will be different simply because of the scale of the lockdown and the scariness of this pandemic?
I think this will be different for a few reasons, Francine. I think the impact on global economies and the fact that the impact was felt so broadly around the world will leave lasting memories, hopefully for populations and policymakers to think through how do we ensure that we're ready in the future. But I also think from a collaboration standpoint, the kind of collaborative structures that were built up in our sector have never been seen before. And then the explosion in science and technology, something I've never seen, and that ability to mount such a scientific response, I think will hopefully lead to more lasting change. The real test will be 3-4 years from now when we look back, can we objectively say if this were to happen again, we would be able to mount a much more rapid and effective response that wouldn't cost the world hundreds of thousands or millions of lives.
Up next, what does it take to eradicate COVID?
We will likely have a vaccine that is viable sometime before the, let's call it the mid of next year. Could be as fast as end of this year.
The world's hopes of getting life back to normal are pinned on a vaccine. Immunizing the population would break the virus's ability to spread. Some of these treatments have shown promise in early tests, leading governments to spend billions of dollars securing doses in the event a candidate proves effective. But public health officials are concerned that displays of vaccine nationalism may prolong the pandemic. Our guest, Vas Narasimhan, believes that in order to end with COVID-19, the pharma industry and national governments will need to show a stronger leadership than they have so far. He says that a cure will only work if it's viable and is made accessible to all. Before the pandemic, the chief executive of Novartis told me that the pharma industry was in dire need of strong leadership.
We lost our way. Now, I think we can get it back. I think it's going to take time and effort. We're going to have to be consistent in how we approach access to medicines. Our margin for error is very small.
Is this pandemic the chance for drug makers to redeem themselves? We're still with Vas Narasimhan. How fast do you think we'll have a working vaccine that is actually safe and usable?
Yeah, I see this as shades of gray as you look at the vaccine. We will likely have a vaccine that is viable sometime before the, let's call it the mid of next year. Could be as fast as end of this year. But I expect that vaccine may not have the optimal efficacy, may not have the full safety data, won't be fully characterized, and won't have large-scale manufacturing capacity. What I believe is with 70 vaccines in development by the end of next year, we'll be able to solve many of those constraints and then actually have a vaccine that we're confident in, have safety, efficacy, large-scale manufacturing, and can be used in large populations. Now, what that means in practice is we're going to have to make some difficult calls in the coming months. What is efficacious enough? What is safe enough? And then with limited supplies, who will really need the vaccine most urgently in the near term? Those are complex discussions. Those are the discussions we're going to need to have with the public policy community in the coming months.
Is there a danger that we're developing a vaccine without fully understanding the virus? And so it's difficult to track, it's difficult to see how it mutates, it's difficult to know who to vaccinate first, given we don't exactly know why people fight it with T cells and others with antibodies.
We're certainly moving at breakneck speed with the vaccine development. So there are many open questions. It's worth noting that typically the experience has been to develop a novel vaccine takes about 10 years. And that takes that long because we typically want to deeply characterize the vaccine, understand in many different patient populations in phase 2 studies, then go to large-scale phase 3 studies, and then follow these patients for a year. In this instance, we're completely skipping phase 2 and going directly into large-scale phase 3 studies without understanding a lot about the biology of the virus. So I think given the scale of the pandemic, I understand why that's being done. But I think it's really important that we support global regulatory agencies to really have rigorous standards. The worst thing would be that we roll out a vaccine that too fast, we lose public trust for a future vaccine for COVID, and then perhaps even more importantly, we lose the broader public trust on vaccines in general, which has saved billions of lives over the last century.
But you helped develop the H1N1 vaccine, which only took 6 months. Is that because we had a different basis for that?
You know, when you go back in time with influenza pandemics, we've built up so much know-how. We have manufacturing facilities, we have technologies we deeply understand. So in a sense, what we do with pandemic influenza is we have the architecture all set up and we change the cassette of the virus. And then we can know pretty well that we're going to generate a very strong protective immune response. In this instance, we're pretty much doing everything new. Platforms are new. The technology platforms we're using for the vaccine are new. The virus is new. The human population has never seen this kind of virus before, whereas with influenza, we have influenza every year. So there's a lot more complexity with this particular vaccine development. And it's worth noting we didn't really succeed in developing a vaccine for the first SARS outbreak in 2000, or MERS, which happened a few years ago, and only partially with respect to Ebola. So we have to be humble with respect to figuring out, is a vaccine really safe or effective?
Are regulators working together? Who do you trust? Are there, do you trust the Russian vaccine, the Chinese vaccine, the American vaccine? How difficult is it to understand what regulators behind the scenes are actually doing?
I've had the opportunity to lead the pharmaceutical industry's engagement with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. There, I would say they're being extraordinarily rigorous. They have the right standards. They've set clear policies out. They want at least 50% efficacy. They want 6 months of safety data. They're holding the vaccines to the appropriate standards. And from what I understand, they're also collaborating with the European regulators to ensure similar standards are applied, though we don't know yet what exactly the European regulators will require. We are in a world at the moment, though, where I think given the severity of the pandemic, individual regulatory agencies may take a different approach. We see with the Russian agency that they took a different approach, requiring a lesser data standard than would typically be expected. I hope that regulators, US, Europe, and around the world hold vaccines to the high standard. And at the same time, we can accelerate therapies. I mean, we can do therapies for patients who get COVID, whether those are repurposed drugs or novel drugs, so we can manage this pandemic as best we can until we have a vaccine we can trust.
What are the challenges of immunizing the world, actually? Is it distribution? Is it who gets it first? Or is it just a challenge of pricing?
I think, Francine, there's a wide range of challenges we're going to have to overcome. Right now, there's, of course, a big element of geopolitics, of kind of who wants to control vaccine supply, and you see a lot of bilateral agreements being signed. I saw this as well in H1N1. Not ideal for optimally distributing vaccines, but it's the reality of what we're in. So right now we have the geopolitics. We're going to have the challenge of scaling up manufacturing. We don't know which vaccine yet really works, but regardless, scaling up manufacturing to billions of doses, getting billions of vials and syringes, getting billions of manufacturing supply chains up and running to produce that amount of doses is going to be, of course, a challenge. And then the supply chain into countries. I learned in 2009, this is not as straightforward as it sounds. Whether it's ensuring there's what's called a cold chain to ensure the vaccine is maintained cold, whether or not there's the right equipment for the nurses, do we have the right approach to tracking who got the vaccine, who didn't get the vaccine? All of this is going to have to get sorted out in very short order if we do find a vaccine that works.
Up next, pharma after COVID.
I hope that coming out of COVID-19, we'll have a bigger appreciation that how important it is to invest in these kinds of next generation technologies.
Advances in cell and gene therapies are beginning to yield powerful new treatments for some of the most devastating illnesses, but COVID-19 has thrown a spanner in the works. Before the pandemic, drug makers were more focused on targeting conditions and technologies than can set them apart from rivals. Our guest, Vas Narasimhan, told us gene therapy was going to be the future of pharma.
We went from a world where we had pills and small molecules, medicines, as we had for almost 100 years. We moved to these injectable drugs that also had an incredible impact. And now we're able to start editing the genome.
But needs must, and at present, all hands are on deck to find a cure that would mean the end of this current pandemic. What does leadership in pharma look like beyond the pandemic? Novartis Chief Executive Vas Narasimhan is still with us.
How will medicine change in the next 5 to 10 years? I know we talked in the past about cell and genome therapy. Does that movement get accelerated because of the pandemic, or does it actually get pushed back?
At the moment, I'd say we're seeing a little bit of a slowdown, I think, in our pace of innovation, but I hope it will pick up again as the energy around new technologies really picks up. When you look at it, we're entering an exciting phase independent of COVID-19, where we're seeing whole new modalities emerge. We operated in a world, we primarily had pills, chemicals that we gave for patients for nearly 50, 70 years from 1900 to 1970, 1980. Then we had the advent of what are called biologics, proteins we could give patients to treat their diseases. And then more recently, and our company has tried to take a leadership approach in this, we've had the emergence of gene therapies, cell therapies, radioligand therapies, RNA therapies, and the RNA technologies are playing an incredibly important role with COVID. These four new technologies will reshape medicine for the next decade. I hope that coming out of COVID-19, we'll have a bigger appreciation that how important it is to invest in these kinds of next generation technologies. And then while we see a slowdown initially, we'll see an acceleration in next year and the years to come.
So Vas, how does that exactly work? Gene therapy is basically when you're, I guess, a child or younger, you're at risk at diabetes. And so you take a treatment that will avoid you having it in the future. Again, that's I guess a one-off, but it could be an expensive treatment. So how do you look at who pays for what and when, and what if you don't have the money for that?
It's interesting, Francine. What we're seeing right now with our first launches in this space, one in cell therapy, one in gene therapy. In gene therapy, what we do is we use a safe, attenuated, as we call it, virus to edit the genes or insert a gene into cells that are affected by a genetic condition in children, and we hope over time in adults, to give them a one-time therapy to give to a dramatic health benefit. And what we see with that is pretty amazing things. We see infants who would otherwise have died in the first year of life, meeting their normal milestones, going to preschool, the kind of things that bring really tears to your eyes when you see the progress. With our cell therapy is a similar story. We reprogram, take cells out of the body, immune cells, reprogram them, put them back into the body to kill cancer cells. And we see children who were otherwise about to die, maybe within 30 days, now reaching 8 years cancer-free. Now, initially, when we rolled these out as one-time therapies and tried to explain that we were avoiding a decade or decades of costly therapy with this one-time therapy, therefore we priced it in a way that provides value over time, there was a big shock to the system. And I learned a lot through that and how to better educate policymakers. But we sit here today, our cell therapy is reimbursed in over 20 countries. Zolgensma, our gene therapy, is rapidly being reimbursed around the world, already reimbursed in US, Japan, Germany, and multiple other markets. So what's been interesting is when you do the right education and explain the long-term value proposition, policymakers eventually come around.
I mean, our health is now anything, nobody talks about anything else, but frankly, our health. Does it change the social contract between, an individual and a country of what they're expecting in terms of health? And how does that change relationship with pharmaceutical companies?
I see a few shifts in the way I think individuals are seeing their role. One is there is now an expectation that public health organizations within a country have the ability to respond very quickly to a crisis like this, and that healthcare systems are able to respond as well. I also think we're seeing one of the great challenges is kind of, again, a moral dilemma, is an individual's behavior can have consequences to a broader population. We see that, we're going to see that in a few different dimensions. One, we see that, of course, with young people having asymptomatic coronavirus infections, but then potentially spreading it into at-risk populations. We're going to see the same with vaccines. We know with vaccines, if you get to about 60, 70% of populations vaccinated, you have something what's called the herd effect. The herd effect means while you don't get everybody vaccinated, if you get enough people vaccinated, the whole herd is protected. The entire group is protected. But if people don't want to get vaccinated enough, then we'll never get to that herd immunity. So I think there's that individual expectation, but also what is the individual's role in the overall public health context? Now, for our industry, a few shifts are happening. One, there's an increased interest in clinical trials and the role patients can play in clinical trials. That's a big shift, and I'm hopeful that will carry over. It's always striking to me when I look at the data, it is incredibly small, the percentage of patients who could participate in clinical trials who do participate in clinical trials. And the pace of medical innovation would accelerate dramatically if we could get more patients into clinical trials. And then the other element of the contract that we've already talked about is access to medicines. I think the expectation of society that it's not going to be enough that we get these great innovations, people need access to the innovation.
How do you see AI, artificial intelligence, developing in the medical world? And can they eventually, robots, replace physicians, or is there always need for the human mind?
We've made big investments at Novartis, and I've been looking very closely at the world of AI for a while now in healthcare. We say Novartis wants to be a company that reimagines medicine, leading medicines company powered by data science and digital technologies. AI has been interesting. One of the most important things with respect to AI is to identify where it can have a big impact, but also to understand where its limitations are. I think companies that have done this well understand quickly you need very good data that's well architected and clean. You need to understand the limits of algorithms. And if you understand those things, then you can deploy AI very quickly. We're seeing a few places where the use cases are really accelerating. One, in our discovery engine of finding new medicines, algorithms can help us solve the puzzle of how do you find a molecule that can unlock a lock in the human body to have the effect that we want to have, kind of these miracles of medicine. Algorithms can help us solve these really tough problems. We're trying to unlock billions of years of cellular evolution, and they really help us accelerate that. The second thing we're seeing is with AI that all of the imaging and medical data that we're collecting, AI can help us process that data much, much faster. I've not yet seen how it could help necessarily with COVID, but with anything where you take a scan of the eye, the scan of the body, AI is much better at reading those scans and finding patterns and help us better, better develop and hopefully better identify patients. And the third big area has been in the whole world of manufacturing, supply chain, and operations. We run our clinical trials now powered by AI algorithms. We run our manufacturing supply chain powered by AI algorithms. And if anything, COVID-19 has accelerated all of that. I would point out, though, there have been instances where we failed. I mean, we find that AI hasn't solved everything in a magic way. And that's an important thing to bear in mind as well.
Vas, I know you also started something called Unbossed, so you can do the hashtag Unbossed, which is basically what empowering people to speak up and challenge their boss. How has that been going during the pandemic? I mean, it's difficult because you don't see people face to face. Does it empower people to speak up, or has it actually been quite difficult having your workforce at home?
I think it's been one of the keys to our success. A few years ago, we said we wanted to create an inspired, curious, unbossed culture. And that links to really a deeper understanding what all the research shows of human motivation. Fundamentally, knowledge workers are motivated by a sense of purpose, a sense of personal improvement and curiosity, and a sense of feeling empowered that if you draw the lines on the tennis court, you let your team play. You don't micromanage, you remove obstacles. That's what we ask of our leaders. When we went to remote working, this all got put on hyperdrive. I mean, we had no choice but to empower our teams simply because everybody was remote and everybody was working through these technology platforms. So I think it enabled us to adapt very quickly. As I said, our trials, our manufacturing network, our digital platforms, our ability to reach customers, all worked seamlessly. If you had asked me the last time we met in January in Davos, if you moved 95,000 people at your company onto a completely digital remote working, will you see any disruption to your operations? I would have probably said, yes, we'll see a pretty significant disruption. And yet we didn't. We were actually able to pull it off. Huge learning for us. And I think the culture change really enabled that.
Vas Narasimhan, thank you so much for joining us on Leaders with Lacqua.
Thank you, Francine.